everyone, today we're going to be talking about the endocrinology system. So here are the objectives of endocrinology. You should be able to identify and know the function of hormones released by the posterior pituitary. Also know the hormones released by the anterior pituitary and their function. Know the Hello everyone, today we're going to talk about the endocrinology system. Okay, so here are the objectives. You should be able to identify the hormones released by the posterior pituitary and the function of each hormone. Apart from that, you should be able to list all of the releasing hormones which are released from the hypothalamus and what their function is. Then moving on, you should be able to identify all the stimulating hormones which are released by the anterior pituitary gland and what their function is. Identify the target hormones, released and their function. Each target hormone is released from a different endocrine gland. Explain the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Please know this step by step, it is very important. And of course, what is the function of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which is also called the RAS system. Explain step by step how thyroid hormones are produced by our thyroid gland. Again, it's a very important system. Identify the hormones involved in calcium balance and how they basically maintain the calcium balance. Example, whenever calcium levels are high, how do they bring them back down? Versus when they're low, how do they bring it back up? Identify the hormones involved in glucose balance. Same thing. Basically know what organs release those hormones and how those hormones bring your glucose levels back up or your glucose levels back down. Identify the hormones released by the adrenal medulla and their function. Okay, so these are the basics. Now, this basically shows all of the endocrine glands in our body, and the ones which are in the pink box, you are responsible to know them for basically this upcoming exam. So, know the hormones released by the hypothalamus, so the releasing hormones and the inhibitory hormones. Know the hormones released by the pituitary gland, and there's anterior lobe as well as posterior lobe. So you have to know the ACTH, TSH, FSH, LH, prolactin, and growth hormone. From the posterior lobe, ADH and oxytocin. Know the hormones released by the adrenal glands. Adrenal glands has adrenal cortex, adrenal medulla. Within the adrenal gland or adrenal cortex, know about cortisol, aldosterone, and also the sex hormones. From the medulla, epinephrine and norepinephrine. For the kidneys, at the moment, only know about renin. For the thyroid gland, know about T4, T3, and calcitonin. For the parathyroid gland, know parathyroid hormone. For the pancreas, know glucagon, insulin, and somatostatin. Okay? Any other hormone that has not been included in this chapter will be covered somewhere else when we deal with that particular topic. Okay. So let's start. If you guys recall from your anatomy, there are two master glands that are part of the endocrine system, which is the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So in the image, A is the hypothalamus, and basically B and C collectively is called the pituitary gland. So here's the hypothalamus, pituitary. Now the pituitary gland is broken up into two parts. Here is B. B is the anterior pituitary gland, and then C, which is the posterior pituitary gland, or the posterior lobe. D is basically a stalk, or the infundibulum, and it basically connects the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary. How is the hypothalamus connected to the anterior pituitary? It basically has its own set of blood vessels that only span from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. So as you can see, these are specialized blood vessels that only span from the hypothalamus into the anterior pituitary. Now, let's focus on the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary first, and then we'll look at the other ones. So, between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary, so right here is the hypothalamus, here is the posterior pituitary, you actually see specialized cells that span. So, right here, these, the blue and the green, are called the neuroendocrine cells. Why are they called neuroendocrine cells? Structurally, they look like neurons. They have the dendrite, cell body, axon, and the axon terminal. But they function like endocrine cells because these cells release hormones, not neurotransmitters. So you can see the nuclei and the dendrites, or the cell body and the dendrites, are found in the hypothalamus. Whereas the axon body makes up the infundibulum, or the stalk, and the axon terminals is found in the posterior pituitary. So, you can see there are two different cells. There is the green and the blue, because they're two different type of nuclei, or cell bodies. So, the supraoptic nuclei releases a hormone called ADH, and paraventricular nuclei releases a hormone called oxytocin. Actually, let me rephrase that. So, supraoptic produces and secretes ADH, paraventricular produces and secretes oxytocin. So, since I said that the nuclei or the cell body and the dendrites are found in the hypothalamus, whereas the axon terminal is found in the posterior pituitary. So, in case of ADH, supraoptic nuclei, which is found in the hypothalamus, it will basically produce the hormone ADH. Once it's produced, it will send it down, and the hormone will be stored in the posterior pituitary. So for ADH and oxytocin, hypothalamus will produce them, but the posterior pituitary will secrete them when it is time to be released, whenever body needs them. Okay, let's talk about ADH more in depth. ADH stands for antidiuretic hormone. As the name suggests, it's basically inhibiting you from urinating. Okay? It's basically holding on to water. So what do you think the signals are going to be for ADH release? There's two signals. Either one can happen or both of them can happen. One of them is increased solute concentration. So you basically increase osmolarity, plasma osmolarity. Basically you're dehydrated, so dehydration. That's one signal. Another signal is a drop in blood pressure. So anytime your blood pressure drops or your plasma osmolarity increases, both of them are signal to cause your posterior pituitary to release a hormone called ADH. Once ADH is released, it actually travels to the kidneys. Now to be specific, where in the kidneys? It actually travels to the collecting ducts. Now what does it do in the collecting ducts? It will actually insert water channels, and therefore water can be reabsorbed. Okay. So right here you can see your collecting duct, and whatever remains at the end of the tubule, end of the nephron, will basically become urine. So right here you have water. And right now, water cannot be reabsorbed because there is no ADH present. Now, let's look at when ADH is present. So again, we basically have our tubule. Here's the water. Whatever remains at the end will basically become urine. But now ADH is present. ADH has been secreted by the posterior pituitary. So the ADH will travel to the kidneys and where specifically in the collecting ducts. And when it goes there, it will insert water channels. And now, because water channels have been inserted, water can be reabsorbed. because we're taking out the water, there's less water left in the nephron, and therefore there's less urine production. Where did this water go? It goes back into our bloodstream. And when basically water goes back into our bloodstream, it brings your blood pressure back up, and it causes your osmolarity to come down. Okay? So you're not dehydrated anymore. So this is how ADH works. Now let's look at oxytocin. So what causes your posterior pituitary to release oxytocin? When your cervix or uterus is basically stretching and contracting, that is one signal to cause posterior pituitary to release oxytocin. Another one is the breast sucking. Okay? When the baby is actually sucking on the breast, it actually is a neural signal to cause your posterior pituitary to release oxytocin. Okay? So before pregnancy or during labor, it's this, but after delivery, it's the breast sucking. Now, what happens once oxytocin has been released? It goes to two different sites. It goes to your uterus, and it goes to the breast. What does it do? In the uterus, it causes the myometrium to contract. And in the breast, it actually causes milk to be ejected. So it allows milk to be let down. So what do you think the function of oxytocin is after delivery? Because of course, during delivery, you need oxytocin, so delivery can happen, labor can happen. But what is the function of oxytocin for the uterus after delivery? This is how basically the uterus comes back to its normal size and shape. So when the baby is breastfeeding, oxytocin is released, and that oxytocin allows milk to be ejected, plus it causes the uterus to contract, therefore it can go back into its original shape and size. Okay. Now, so that was the two hormones released by the posterior pituitary. Okay, those are the only two hormones released by the posterior pituitary. Now we're going to actually look at the hormones released by the anterior pituitary, and that becomes more complicated. So here's a chart, okay, and I'm going to show you what each portion of the chart means. And then the next slide, it actually lists all of the hormones. So this is the connection between the hypothalamus and basically the anterior pituitary, and then the rest of the endocrine glands. So the way it works is hypothalamus will release hormones. They will in turn either stimulate or inhibit the anterior pituitary. If they stimulate it, anterior pituitary releases hormones, and those hormones go and affect other hormones, or sorry, other glands, and now these are called target glands. In response to that, the target glands now releases target hormones. These target hormones will now go to basically different tissues in our body and exert their function. So right here, so this right here is the hypothalamus. This space right here are the hormones released by the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus releases stimulatory hormones as well as inhibitory hormones. 5 stimulatory hormones, meaning they stimulate the anterior pituitary to release hormones in turn. And they release 2 inhibitory hormones, which are in red, meaning they inhibit the anterior pituitary from releasing hormone. This right here is the effect on basically the anterior pituitary. Okay. This space right here are the hormones released by the anterior pituitary. And the hormones released by the anterior pituitary are called stimulating hormones. These stimulatory hormones which are released by the hypothalamus is called releasing hormones. Now, this area shows you the effect of the stimulatory hormones on the target glands. This area will contain hormones released, not hormones, sorry. This area shows you the target glands. These are hormones released by the target glands, and this is the overall function of those target hormones. Yeah? So, as you can see, these are basically all of the hormones. Excuse me. you will see that they're mostly abbreviation. These abbreviations, the proper name, you can find them on the first page. Okay? So the way you read this chart is you go straight down. Okay? You don't read this way. It's each column is one, basically you could consider it pathway. Okay? So hypothalamus will release a hormone called CRH, corticotropic releasing hormone. CRH will now stimulate the anterior pituitary to release a hormone called ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. ACTH will now stimulate the adrenal cortex. Adrenal cortex in turn will release 3 hormones: cortisol, aldosterone, and sex hormones. Now these 3 hormones basically work all throughout the body. So cortisol mainly works throughout the body, different tissues. Aldosterone is mainly for increasing blood pressure. And the sex hormones are for your sex characteristics, your secondary sex characteristics. So that's one pathway. Now let's look at the second one. Hypothalamus will release TRH, thyroid releasing hormone. TRH will stimulate the anterior pituitary to release a hormone called TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. TSH will now stimulate the thyroid gland. In turn, thyroid gland releases T3, T4, okay? Thyroxine and triiodothyronine. What is the function of T3, T4? Basically, it's for metabolism. Let's move over. Hypothalamus releases a hormone called GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. That hormone will travel to the anterior pituitary and stimulate it to release 2 hormones in turn, FSH and LH. FSH is follicle stimulating hormone, LH is luteinizing hormone. FSH and LH will now travel to the gonads, and they will go to gonads in males and females, but of course they have different function. So let's look at what the function of them are in males. So FSH in males causes sperm production. LH in males causes testosterone production. Let's look at the function in females. LH in females causes ovulation, while FSH in females causes egg and estrogen to be produced. Let's move on to the next column. This is GHRH. So hypothalamus releases GHRH, which is growth hormone releasing hormone. Okay, so hypothalamus releases growth hormone releasing hormone, which will stimulate the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. Growth hormone will now stimulate basically 3 sites: liver, muscle, and bone. In the liver, growth hormone causes the liver to produce another hormone called IGFS, insulin-like growth factors. What is the function of growth hormone in muscle and bone? It basically causes muscle and bone growth. Okay? The last stimulatory, because as you can see, all of them stimulated the anterior pituitary. The last stimulatory is PRH. So hypothalamus releases PRH, which is prolactin releasing hormone. PRH will stimulate the anterior pituitary to release a hormone called prolactin. Prolactin will now basically stimulate the breast, and it has 2 different functions on the breast. It will cause the breast to produce milk, and it will cause the breast enlargement. Okay? So those are the 5 stimulatory hormones. Now let's look at the 2 inhibitory hormones. So hypothalamus releases 2 inhibitory hormones. One is somatostatin, other is dopamine. Okay? When the hypothalamus releases somatostatin, that hormone goes and inhibits the anterior pituitary. So when somatostatin is released, anterior pituitary is no longer functioning, therefore growth hormone is not produced. If growth hormone is not produced, basically the liver, muscle, and bone are no longer stimulated, therefore liver is not producing IGFS. Basically this whole thing does not occur. That's one inhibitory hormone. Let's look at the second inhibitory hormone, which is dopamine. So when the hypothalamus releases dopamine, it inhibits the anterior pituitary. So anterior pituitary is not functioning. If it does not work, it does not release prolactin. When prolactin is not released, the breast is not stimulated, therefore there is no milk production and no breast enlargement. This is why us females, if we're not pregnant, if we're not breastfeeding, we do not actually have milk being produced in our breast. Okay? You should know this chart in and out. It's going to be useful in this class, as well as patho, as well as pharm, and your core. Okay? Because these are where all the tests come in. For example, let's say a person who has too much thyroid hormones. Blood tests are done. They will always check for the TRH, TSH, and T3, T4. So from there you can tell which endocrine gland is at fault. Okay? And the way I can ask you this right now is I could say a person releases cortisol. Which hormone was released from the anterior pituitary to release cortisol, which is ACTH, because ACTH causes the adrenal cortex to release cortisol in turn. Okay? So question 1. It's a hypothalamus, because it says that the supraoptic nuclei, the dendrites and cell bodies, was damaged. Where are those located? Within the hypothalamus. The answer is ADH, because it tells you it's a supraoptic nuclei. Supraoptic nuclei produces and secretes ADH. Okay. Let's quickly talk about the growth hormone. So growth hormone are released or produced and released by cells called somatotrophs, which are located in the anterior pituitary. What causes growth hormone to be released? Basically, when the hypothalamus releases GHRH. Now, growth hormone has different function based on your age. In childhood and adolescence, what is the effects of growth hormone? It causes basically, it stimulates the muscle and the bone, and it increases the mass and the length. Okay, so it causes your bones and your muscle to basically grow. And it also causes your liver to release insulin-like growth factors. Now, of course, once you have reached your adulthood, you're no longer going to grow. You have reached your limit. So what is the function of growth hormone after that? So in adult, there's a different function. The function of growth hormone in adults is basically to, it's metabolism. It causes your glycogen to be converted into glucose, and it causes your fats to be converted into glucose. So it will cause glycogen to turn into glucose, which is glycogenolysis. It will cause your fats to be converted into glucose, which is basically gluconeogenesis. So it's basically to maintain your glucose levels. Another thing I forgot to write down, that even in adults, growth hormone will cause insulin-like growth factors to be released. So insulin-like growth factors is released both in adults as well as adolescents and children. Now let's talk about the adrenal cortex. Adrenal cortex has 3 distinct layers. So the outermost layer, okay, it's right here, it's called the zona glomerulosa. It releases a hormone called aldosterone. The second layer is zona fasciculata. It releases a hormone called cortisol. The innermost layer of the adrenal cortex is zona ventricularis, and it releases 6 hormones. And this is the adrenal medulla, okay, which releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. So let's look at the adrenal medulla first, and then we'll come back and look at the adrenal cortex. So adrenal medulla produces epinephrine, norepinephrine. Basically, this is part of your sympathetic nervous system. Okay? So it activates your sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight and flight response. So example, let's say this person, they basically are they basically see a snake, and that is basically a stressful situation for them. So as soon as they see it, it basically causes a nerve signal to the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. What does epinephrine and norepinephrine do? It increases heart rate, breathing rate, blood sugar levels. It increases blood pressure via vasoconstricting. It causes the bronchi to dilate, and it causes blood supply to be diverted toward the vital organs. So that is adrenal medulla. But of course, what else happens? That stressful situation actually causes ACTH to be released from the adrenal, ACTH to be released from the anterior pituitary, which in turn causes the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. And cortisol will basically cause your liver to release glucose. Okay. So now let's look at basically cortisol. Your daily rhythm, your morning peaks, okay, and fever and hypoglycemia, they will all stimulate your hypothalamus to release CRH. CRH will now stimulate your anterior pituitary to release ACTH. ACTH in turn will stimulate your adrenal cortex to release cortisol. Once cortisol is released, there's a negative feedback loop. It has to control how much cortisol is released. So cortisol will go back, inhibit ACTH to be released, and inhibit CRH. Therefore, it controls its own secretion. Which cells release ACTH from the anterior pituitary? It's corticotrophs. Let's look at the function of cortisol. Function of cortisol, it maintains blood sugar levels. So it does fat and protein metabolism, meaning gluconeogenesis. It does carbohydrate metabolism, meaning causes your glycogen to be broken down to glucose molecules. It again suppresses the immune system. It's anti-inflammatory, so it basically suppresses your immune system as well. Maintains your blood pressure. It activates the CNS and maintains blood vessel tone and proper cardiac contraction. Now, cortisol is, there's a rhythm, okay? There's a daily rhythm. Cortisol is the lowest basically at midnight. And as you start approaching daylight, as you start approaching your time to wake up, it peaks. So cortisol peaks basically 1 to 2 hours before you wake up. Waking up is a stressful situation for your body. Therefore, it peaks 1 to 2 hours before, trying to help you deal with that stress. And then basically as the day progresses, slowly the cortisol levels start to decline. And it is again the lowest at basically midnight. And then once again, it slowly starts to rise. That is your circadian rhythm. So individuals who basically, let's say all of a sudden work graveyards or something, if their circadian rhythm, the cortisol levels do not match their new sleep and wake cycle, they will have a really hard time. They will start getting diseases. So now, let's look at basically sex hormones. Hypothalamus will release CRH. CRH will stimulate the anterior pituitary to release ACTH. ACTH will now go to adrenal cortex and cause sex hormones to be released. These sex hormones, of course, have to control its own production. So they will go back and inhibit ACTH to be released and CRH to be released. So which are the sex hormones which are released? They're actually called the weak androgens. So what are they? They're the androstenedione and dihydroepiandrostenedione, which is always abbreviated as DHEA. And the last one is estradiol. So there's 3 sex hormones which are released. And these are not potent sex hormones. These are not estrogen, progesterone. These are the weaker forms. So it's androstenedione, that's first one. Another one is DHEA, here's the full name. And then the third one is estradiol. So these are the 3 weak androgens. And they're responsible for your secondary sex characteristics. Example, puberty, your sex drive. And of course, estradiol is a weaker form of estrogen. So after menopause, the only form of estrogen that females have is the estradiol. Okay? Now, this DHEA, when it actually arrives to ovaries or the testes, it gets converted to testosterone and estrogen. So DHEA, when it arrives to the gonads, it's going to be converted into the potent sex hormones, which are estrogen and testosterone. Okay. Now, let's talk about the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. This is a very important system because a lot of blood pressure drugs will come from this cycle. Okay? So before I start, basically let me set up some background. Your basically kidneys in the afferent arteriole actually have baroreceptors, and the function of these baroreceptors is to detect blood pressure. Another thing I want to say, angiotensinogen. This is basically inactive protein. It's basically an inactive hormone, and it is released by the liver. Okay? So produced by the liver and is secreted into the plasma. And it's always found there, but it's in an inactive form. Okay? So basically, this is a set, and now, or the background, now we're going to go through the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system step by step, and you should know it step by step. So, step 1. Blood flow is, when blood pressure drops, your baroreceptors detect that drop. So, decrease in blood pressure. So whenever your blood pressure drops, your baroreceptors, which are found within the afferent arteriole, will detect that. So they will know that your blood pressure has dropped. As soon as the kidney, okay, because the afferent arterioles are found within the kidney, as soon as your kidney detects there's a drop in blood pressure, it will release renin. It will release a hormone called renin. So now renin is in the plasma. As soon as renin enters the plasma, it's going to find angiotensinogen. Remember I told you angiotensinogen is produced by the liver and is secreted in the plasma, but it's in the inactive form. So as soon as renin basically arrives, it's going to grab angiotensinogen, convert it to angiotensin 1. Okay? Now, angiotensin 1 will now travel to the lungs. Within the lungs, we have an enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme. Its abbreviated is the ACE enzyme. So in the lungs, you have the enzyme called ACE, or angiotensin converting enzyme. So when angiotensin 1 arrives there, this enzyme converts angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. Once angiotensin 2 has been produced, it basically now travels to the adrenal cortex. But while it's traveling to the adrenal cortex, it's basically causing vasoconstriction of the blood vessels. So as soon as angiotensin 2 is produced, it travels to the adrenal cortex. But while it's traveling to the adrenal cortex in the bloodstream, it's causing the blood vessels to vasoconstrict. And when you cause your blood vessels to vasoconstrict, your blood pressure rises. Okay? So vasoconstriction causes blood pressure to increase. So now it finally finds its way to the adrenal cortex. And in the adrenal cortex, it actually causes aldosterone to be released. So angiotensin 2 travels to the adrenal cortex, causes aldosterone to be released. Aldosterone is a hormone. Now aldosterone travels to the kidneys. Where does it go into the kidneys? It actually goes to the collecting duct. So aldosterone travels to the kidneys. Where? Collecting duct. And in the collecting duct, it actually causes salt retention. But to be more specific, so once aldosterone is released, it travels to the collecting duct. It causes sodium to be reabsorbed potassium to be secreted. So that is a function of aldosterone, sodium reabsorption and potassium secretion. Okay? So the sodium goes back into our bloodstream, potassium is secreted out. Now the golden rule is wherever sodium goes, water follows. Because we have reabsorbed sodium, water follows. So there's increased H2O content, and that causes an increase in blood pressure. As soon as your blood pressure has elevated to its set point, the cycle ends. Okay? So let's go through this cycle once again. So step 1. A drop in blood pressure is detected by baroreceptors found in the afferent arteriole of the kidneys. As soon as the kidneys detect there's a drop in blood pressure, it will release a hormone called renin. Renin will now be secreted into the plasma, and in the plasma it will find angiotensinogen, which is inactive. It will convert angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 now travels to the lungs, and within the lungs you have an enzyme waiting for it. The name of the enzyme is angiotensin converting enzyme, or the ACE enzyme. As soon as angiotensin 1 arrives there, angiotensin 1 is converted into angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 now travels to the adrenal cortex. While it's traveling to the adrenal cortex, it's actually causing the blood vessel to vasoconstrict. That's causing a rise in blood pressure. Now, when it finally finds its way to the adrenal cortex, it causes the adrenal cortex to release another hormone, which is aldosterone. Once aldosterone has been released, it travels basically to the kidneys, where? To the collecting duct. And what does aldosterone do in the collecting duct? It actually causes sodium to be reabsorbed, potassium to be secreted. And because you have just reabsorbed sodium, the golden rule is wherever sodium goes, water follows. So your water content has increased, and all of that is dumped into the bloodstream. Therefore, your blood pressure rises. As soon as your blood pressure rises and is now in the normal range, the system is finished. So this is the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system, or the RAS system. Okay, so now let's talk about how T3, T4 are basically released. When there's a low T3, T4 in your bloodstream, that's going to stimulate the hypothalamus to release TRH. TRH is going to stimulate the anti-pituitary to release TSH. TSH will now go to the thyroid gland and cause your thyroid gland to release T4 and T3. Now, majority of the hormone that is released is basically T4. Only a small portion is T3. When these hormones arrive to your peripheral tissues, okay, your peripheral tissues cannot utilize T4. So any T4 that has arrived to the peripheral tissues is converted back into T3 via an enzyme called iodinase. So any hormone that arrives at the peripheral tissues, the T4 is converted back into T3 via iodinase, because our peripheral tissues is unable to utilize T4. Now, of course, T3, T4 have to control their own production. So as soon as T3, T4 levels have started to rise, it's going to go back, inhibit hypothalamus from releasing TRH. It's going to inhibit the pituitary or anti-pituitary gland from releasing T3, T4. Okay? So let's go through it once again. When you have low T3, T4, it causes your hypothalamus to release TRH, which in turn causes your anti-pituitary to release TSH. That will cause your thyroid gland to release T4, T3. Majority of the hormone release is T4. When that T4 arrives to the peripheral tissues, it cannot be utilized. So your peripheral tissues have an enzyme called iodinase, which converts the T4 into T3. Whatever T3 that arrives to the tissues is utilized. And of course, there's negative feedbacks. So T3, T4 inhibit their own production by inhibiting anterior and anti-pituitary and the hypothalamus. Now, your T3, T4 basically have effect on majority of your body. Okay? it's needed for normal functioning. So it's needed so your normal, your cardiovascular system works properly, your digestive system, your central nervous system, skeletal, muscular, this is your metabolism. So patients who have too much T3, T4 basically have problems like their increased heart rate, they have diarrhea, they're very hyper, okay, they're very jittery. They're the people who can, they could never just stay still. They're always moving, always, their reflexes are enhanced. In the integumentary system, they have very fine hair, very oily skin and everything. Okay? And these are because their metabolism is very high. They are the ones who can eat, let's say, pastries, junk food all day, but never gain an ounce of weight. Versus people who have low levels of T3, T4, complete opposite. They have low heart rate. They have constipation. They're very slow, okay? When you talk to them, it takes them time to process the information. Even their reflexes are slow. And basically, the integumentary system, they're the ones who have very dry hair, dry skin. In the metabolism, these are the individuals that, they might eat just, let's say, one cookie, and they tend to gain a lot of weight. Okay? So everything slows down in patients who have low T3, T4, where everything speeds up in patients who have too much T3, T4. So now we're going to see how T3, T4 are produced by the endocrine gland, or the thyroid gland. Because there are a lot of patients that you will encounter that have either too much T3 or too less. And therefore, there are a lot of drugs out there that basically inhibit some vital segment of this cycle. Okay? So, before I start explaining you how thyroid hormones are produced by the thyroid gland, let's look at anatomy of the thyroid gland for just a second. So right here is a thyroid gland. Here are the cells. These are called the follicular cells. Here is a blood vessel, and the follicular cells are surrounding this fluid area, which is called the colloid. So we're going to actually take this photo, enlarge it. So right here is the blood vessel, here is the follicular cell, and here is the colloid. Colloid contains this amber-colored fluid, and it's like sticky. Okay? So now let's learn how thyroid hormones are produced step by step, and you should know it step by step. So, step 1, thyroglobulin, okay, is produced. Thyroglobulin is a protein, so the ER and the Golgi apparatus, basically they produce a protein called thyroglobulin, and that is secreted into the colloid. So now in the colloid, you have the protein. Second step, this is basically a secondary active transport pump. It's a sodium iodine cotransporter. It actually transports sodium and iodine into the follicular cell. So it's an active transporter. It's a secondary active transport. So sodium goes down its concentration gradient, collects energy to transport iodine into the follicular cell. Now when iodine is into the follicular cell, it basically has to be converted into iodine, because that's the active form. So that iodide is converted to iodine and then secreted into basically the colloid. So we have now just produced thyroglobulin, we have just basically brought in iodine. Now let's see what happens. As soon as in the colloid you have the protein and you have the iodine molecules, they basically will be combined, giving you MIT and DIT. So MIT is one protein with one iodine molecule. DIT is one protein with two iodine molecules. So MIT and DIT. Once MIT and DIT have formed, now they come together creating T3 and T4. So, up here, this is MIT, right here, this is DIT. When a MIT and a DIT come together, it gives you the hormone T3. Why is it called T3? Because it has 3 iodine molecules. 1, 2, 3. Now, when 2 DITs, so here's one DIT, here's another DIT. When 2 DITs come together, it basically makes T4. Why is this T4? Where does the 4 come from? It's because it has 4 iodine molecules. 1, 2, 3, 4. So now, once you have produced T3, T4, the next step is the hormones are endocytosed back into the follicular cell. Because right now they were in the colloid. Now they have to come back into the follicular cell, so endocytosis occurs. Now, during the endocytosis, you actually brought along some colloid, and you do not want the colloid. So as soon as the vesicle enters the follicular cell, a lysosome fuses with the vesicle. And if you guys recall, lysosome is just filled with enzymes. So as soon as it fuses, it releases all of its enzymes, and these enzymes degrade the colloid. So now you can see there's no more colloid left. And now you just have a vesicle that is filled with T3, T4. Your thyroid gland will hold on to this. It will store the T3, T4 until it is time to be released. So what is the signal the thyroid gland releases? What is the signal the thyroid gland receives that tells it that it's time to release T3, T4 into the circulation? That signal is released from the anterior pituitary, which is TSH. So as soon as TSH binds to the thyroid gland on its receptor, there's exocytosis of T3, T4 into the bloodstream. And this is thyroid hormone production. Let's go through it step by step once more. Step 1, the ER produces thyroglobulin, which is a protein, and is secreted into the colloid. Step 2, iodide is actively brought into the follicular cell via this sodium iodide cotransporter. It's a secondary active transport pump. This iodide that came into is inactive, so we have to convert it into iodine. Okay, so iodide is oxidized into iodine, and then it is secreted into the colloid. Now in the colloid we have the protein and we have iodine. They will combine, giving you MIT and DIT. MIT is one protein with 1 iodine molecule. DIT is one protein with 2 iodine molecules. Once you have the DIT and MIT, then basically they combine, giving you T3, T4. So T3 is MIT and a DIT together, giving you T3. T4 is DIT and DIT came together, giving you T4. Once the hormones are produced, they're endocytosed back into the follicular cell. And due to endocytosis, you now have colloid. You do not want the colloid, so a lysosome fuses with it, releasing its digestive enzymes, and these enzymes will degrade the colloid. So all you have left is a vesicle with T3, T4. When the anterior pituitary releases TSH, that TSH will bind to the thyroid gland, causing exocytosis of T3, T4 into the circulation. Okay, question 3. So, it tells you trauma as a result, supraoptic nuclei is damaged. Supraoptic nuclei produced ADH, so now you don't have ADH. So if you don't have ADH, the body or the kidneys will not be able to reabsorb the water. So the body will not be able to absorb water from the kidneys. Okay. Question 4. So ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme, is found in the lungs. Its function is to convert angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. So the case now tells you anterior pituitary is at fault. So what is the answer? TSH, because TSH is released by basically the anterior pituitary. Now let's talk about basically the pancreas, or at least the endocrine part of the pancreas. So here's a pancreas. Pancreas has two parts. It has an endocrine portion, which are the blue, and that is called islets of Langerhans. And it has this other, yellow area, which is the exocrine part. Right now, we're just going to focus on the endocrine part. Taking a closer look, here is the endocrine part of the pancreas, which are called islets of Langerhans. The endocrine part of pancreas has three cells. It has alpha cell, beta cell, and delta cell. Now, the alpha cell secretes a hormone called glucagon. Beta cell secretes a hormone called insulin. Delta cell secretes a hormone called somatostatin. So alpha is glucagon, beta is insulin, delta is somatostatin. Okay? What is the function of each of these hormones? So alpha basically it releases glucagon, and the function of glucagon is to increase blood glucose levels. So the function of glucagon is to elevate your blood glucose levels. What is the function of insulin? Insulin decreases your blood glucose levels. And then what is the function of somatostatin? It inhibits the alpha and beta cells to release insulin and glucagon. Now, let's see how insulin and glucagon either increase or decrease blood glucose levels. So right here you have a normal level of glucose. So here's a glucose homeostasis. When your glucose levels have increased, it's going to stimulate your pancreas. Which cell in the pancreas? It's going to stimulate your beta cell. Your beta cell in turn is going to release a hormone called insulin. What is the function of insulin? It's supposed to bring your glucose levels back down. But how? Two things. Insulin is going to cause your tissues to uptake glucose, and because glucose is now entering the cells, glucose starts to fall. Another thing it does, it actually travels to the liver, and it causes your liver to take up glucose and convert the glucose into glycogen. So insulin causes your livers to produce glycogen. By causing your tissues to take up glucose, causing your liver to take up glucose, convert it to glycogen, your glucose level falls and therefore comes back to homeostasis. And that stops insulin secretion. Now, another scenario, your blood sugar levels drop. When they fall, it stimulates your pancreas. Which cell? Alpha cell. Alpha cell in turn releases glucagon. What is the function of glucagon? Is to increase your blood glucose levels. So how does it do that? Glucagon travels to the liver. In the liver, it actually causes glycogen, the stored glycogen, to be broken down into glucose molecules. And this glucose will now enter the bloodstream. Therefore, your blood glucose levels start to rise. So, insulin is usually released after eating because your blood glucose levels have increased. Glucagon is usually released when you're a couple of hours after eating, okay? Because your glucose levels start to fall. Okay. Now, you guys know diabetes is a big topic. Diabetes is where diabetes mellitus is a condition in which you don't have insulin. So let's look at how your beta cell actually secrete insulin. Because again, drugs will actually, when you go into pharmacology, you learn about drugs and they will work on the system. So before I actually teach you how your beta cell releases insulin, let's actually look at the beta cell and what channels it contains. So here's the beta cell. It basically has a protein, a channel protein, which is called the GLUT transport. Its function is to allow glucose to come into the cell. Right here is ATP-sensitive potassium channel. Under normal conditions, when the cell is at rest, this channel is open, allowing potassium to leave the cell. This right here is basically voltage-gated calcium channel. Under resting state, this channel is closed. But when this channel opens up, it allows calcium to come in. I forgot to say, so this is ATP sensitive potassium channel. As I said, under rest, during rest, this channel is open, allowing potassium to basically leave. But why do you call it ATP sensitive? Because its state of the channel is dependent on the levels of ATP. When you have low levels of ATP, this channel is open. When you have high levels of ATP, this channel closes. And when this channel closes, potassium will no longer be able to leave the cell. Okay? And the beta cell actually contains vesicles, and these vesicles contain the hormone insulin. Okay. So this is basically backstage. I just did a foundation. Now we're going to see how insulin is secreted. Okay, so this is basically doing rest when the beta cell is not secreting insulin. Let's see what's happening. When you have low blood, so doing rest, when you have low blood glucose levels, you do not want insulin to be secreted. Why? Because if insulin is secreted, it's going to cause your glucose level to go down further, and unfortunately, it can lead to coma. So therefore, your beta cells have to be prevented from releasing insulin. How is that? So because you have low blood glucose levels, glucose is not really entering the cell. So because glucose is not entering the cell, you have low ATP. Oh, it's written right here. Because glucose is not entering, okay? So no glucose is entering, therefore low ATP. Because there's low ATP, there's ATP-sensitive potassium channel remains open. Because this channel is open, potassium is leaving the cell. Potassium is a cation. So anytime positive charge leaves, it causes the interior of the cell to become negative. So the cell is negative, and in physiology we call it, the membrane is hyperpolarized. And because this membrane is hyperpolarized, this voltage-gated calcium channel does not open up. If the calcium channel does not open up, basically there's no influx of calcium. So there's no calcium coming inside, so no calcium. If there's no calcium, there's no exocytosis of insulin. Okay? So during rest, no glucose is coming in, therefore low ATP, therefore ATP-sensitive potassium channel is open, allowing potassium to leave the cell, causing the membrane to become negative, meaning hyperpolarized. This hyperpolarized state will not allow voltage-gated calcium channels to open up, so there's no influx of calcium. If there's no influx of calcium, there's no exocytosis of insulin. These are insulin in here. So this is how during rest insulin is prevented from being secreted. Now let's see how insulin is secreted. So when you have high blood glucose levels, so high plasma glucose levels, let's say after eating, because you have so much glucose, glucose starts to flood. So glucose enters via the GLUT transporter. All of that glucose basically gets converted to ATP. How? Via cellular respiration. So that glucose enters glycolysis, then intermediate step, then Krebs cycle, electron transport chain. And therefore, you're making a lot of ATP. Because now your beta cell has a lot of ATP, it causes this ATP-sensitive potassium channel to close. So this channel is closed. Because this channel closes, potassium is no longer able to leave. So potassium is now stuck inside the cell. Potassium is a cation. So now you have positive charge inside the cell. So the membrane becomes positive. How do you say that in physiology? We say the membrane is depolarized. Because the membrane is depolarized, that depolarization causes the voltage-gated calcium channel to open up. Because this channel opens, calcium is now able to come into the cell. Now because calcium has come into the cell, it actually causes these insulin vesicles to exocytose. So calcium causes exocytosis of insulin. And this is how the beta cell releases insulin. Let's go through it once more. high glucose levels in the plasma. Glucose is coming into the beta cell. All of that glucose is coming into ATP. ATP basically causes this ATP-sensitive potassium channel to close. Potassium is now stuck inside the cell, causing the membrane to become positive, meaning it causes the membrane to become depolarized. That depolarized state causes voltage-gated calcium channel open. Calcium comes in, and calcium causes exocytosis of insulin. So insulin is not being secreted. It's not able to, there's no way for the body to bring your glucose levels back down because there's no insulin. The last part that I want to talk about is the calcium balance. So there are two endocrine glands and two hormones that regulate the calcium balance in our body. One of them is the thyroid gland, and it releases the hormone calcitonin. Then there's parathyroid gland, and it releases the hormone parathyroid hormone. So if you look right here on your neck, a butterfly shape is the thyroid gland. In the posterior aspect, so on the back of the thyroid gland, you find these four small yellow glands, which are called the parathyroid gland. Thyroid gland releases two hormones. It releases calcitonin, which is for calcium, and T3, T4, which is for metabolism. So what is the function of calcitonin? It's to decrease blood calcium levels. Parathyroid gland basically releases a hormone called parathyroid hormone. Its function is to increase calcium levels. So now we're going to see how these two hormones function. So right here is a homeostasis for calcium. Anytime your calcium levels is increased, it stimulates your thyroid gland. In turn, your thyroid gland releases calcitonin. Calcitonin brings your calcium levels back down to homeostasis. Now, another situation, anytime your calcium levels start to fall, it will stimulate your parathyroid gland. Your parathyroid gland will release parathyroid hormone. That in turn will increase your blood calcium levels back up, bringing you back to homeostasis. Now what we're going to do is see exactly how basically calcium is brought back down and how calcium is brought back up. So how exactly does calcitonin and PTH work? Okay, so before you actually look at this and get confused, it's very simple. You need to just remember that calcitonin decreases blood calcium levels, where parathyroid hormone increases blood calcium levels. They basically work on they work on similar organs or glands or tissues in our body. Parathyroid hormone works on kidneys, bones, and intestines. So parathyroid hormone works on kidneys, bones, and intestines. So 3. Whereas the calcitonin only works on 2, kidneys and bone. So kidneys and bone are the site where parathyroid hormone and calcitonin work, but they have opposite function. Parathyroid hormone is the only one that actually works on the intestines. Okay? So let's look at the calcitonin first because it's easier, and then we'll come to this part, which is parathyroid hormone. Anytime your calcium levels have increased, it stimulates basically your thyroid gland. That in turn releases calcitonin. Now, how does calcitonin work? As I mentioned earlier, it works on 2 sites. It goes to your bone and it goes to your kidneys. Let's see what it does in the bone. In the bone, calcitonin actually causes your osteoblasts to be stimulated. Osteoblasts are bone cells that actually build bone. So it will actually go to the bones, it will stimulate your osteoblast. Osteoblasts will now start to build bone. And to build bone, you need calcium. So where do you think osteoblasts are getting the calcium from? Of course, from your bloodstream. So osteoblasts start to pull calcium from your bloodstream and make bone. So because calcium is coming from your bloodstream, your calcium levels start to drop. So, calcitonin causes bone to be made. And by making bone, your calcium levels start to drop. That's one thing. So that's one place it works. Another place it works is on the kidneys. Calcitonin actually causes your kidneys to secrete calcium in the urine. So it doesn't allow calcium to be reabsorbed. It causes your calcium to be secreted in the urine. Okay? So by causing you to urinate all your calcium levels out, basically your blood calcium levels start to drop. So calcitonin brings your calcium levels back down by two things. It causes your bone to be produced, and it causes you to urinate the calcium out. Okay? So by those two mechanisms, your calcium levels comes back down, therefore in homeostasis. Now let's see how parathyroid hormone works. The function of parathyroid hormone is to increase your blood calcium levels. What did I say? Again, the two sides are the same. It works on the bone and it works on the kidneys. And as I said, they're opposites, right? So what does parathyroid hormone do in the bone? It actually goes to the bone and it stimulates osteoclast. Osteoclasts are bone cells that basically break bone down. So it will stimulate your osteoclast. Osteoclasts start to cut bone. Once you cut bone, calcium is released. Where do you think this calcium is going? It runs and enters the bloodstream. So by calcium entering the bloodstream, your calcium levels start to increase. So that's one way. It actually causes your bone to be broken down. Another thing PTH does, it actually goes to your kidneys. In your kidneys, it actually causes your kidneys to reabsorb calcium from your urine. So it doesn't allow you to piss out your calcium. It causes it to take it back in. When you reabsorb it, where does the calcium go? Into the bloodstream. So again, your blood calcium levels are starting to rise. So those are two things. In addition, parathyroid hormone does one more thing. In the kidneys, it actually causes vitamin D to be activated. So your kidneys, PTH causes your kidneys to activate vitamin D. PTH causes vitamin D activation. Once this vitamin D has been activated, this vitamin D goes to the small intestines. Within the small intestines, vitamin D causes calcium to be reabsorbed from your diet. So whatever food you had, or let's say you had a glass of milk, which is high in calcium, parathyroid hormone causes that calcium to be absorbed in the small intestines by activating vitamin D. So once vitamin D has been activated, it goes to the intestines, causes calcium to be reabsorbed. And where does that calcium go? It gets dumped into the bloodstream. So parathyroid hormone causes your blood calcium levels to increase by three ways. Breaking bone down, causing your kidneys to reabsorb calcium so you don't piss it out, and it causes your intestines to absorb calcium from your diet. Okay? And that third way is by activating vitamin D. These are the three ways that parathyroid hormone increases blood calcium levels back up. Okay? And now we are done with endocrinology.